14 years ago, yesterday in fact, on November 1st, 2007, British exchange student Meredith Kercher was murdered in Perugia, Italy. She was just 21 years old. The truth about what happened that night isn't hard to source. Despite the hash of misinformation, prejudice and sloppy police work that began being assembled the moment that police were called to the murder scene. What happened to Meredith Kercher is a tragedy, and to her loved ones she will be forever missed. But this isn't a podcast about Meredith. This isn't a true crime podcast, although that's unquestionably territory within which this podcast subject matter resides. This is a podcast about shame. And this episode is about Amanda Knox. You know Amanda Knox? Or at least you think you do. You probably have an opinion on her. The court of public opinion is vast and far-reaching. Seattle-born Amanda was also an exchange student. She was Meredith's roommate at the time of the murder. Amanda and then boyfriend Raffaele Sollecito were convicted of the murder. She spent 4 years in prison. She got a retrial and was released. There was another trial. She was found guilty that time. Then, on March 27th, 2015, both Amanda and Raffaele were definitively acquitted of their role in the murder. The court report stated that there were sensational failures in the investigation, and that the lower court had been guilty of culpable omissions in ignoring expert testimony that demonstrated contamination of evidence. And if you'd like to know more about the case, the Netflix documentary, also called Amanda Knox, and Amanda's recent interview with Joe Rogan come much recommended. But right now, let's talk about shame. Because what happens when you're cast as a character that you don't know the lines of, in a life that's a play, that's not of your direction? What happens when you walk into a room and hear whispers? When strangers on the internet think they know more than a court of law? What happens when you're given a name, it's doused in oil and mud? How do you reclaim it? Can you reclaim it? This podcast since its beginning has largely hung around one central premise. Can you escape shame? Talking to Amanda, I think maybe we can. And if she can, you can. And I can. My name's James McMahon. You're listening to Shame. And this is my conversation with Amanda Knox. Thanks loads for doing this, Amanda. When I started this podcast, I had the goal of speaking to you and also speaking to Monica Lewinsky. They were the two people I wanted to get on. I'm still waiting on Monica, but I'm over the moon that you've agreed to have a chat with me.
Have you seen her new documentary, 15 Minutes of Shame?
I am laying myself bare to being shamed here. Being in the UK, it's been quite hard work to get hold of, so I've had to use covert means.
Well, I will not say a thing.
Don't tell anyone. Let's just keep it between us. But no, I tweeted the other day. I don't know whether you saw it, but I was watching the trailer for that, and I was rewatching your Netflix documentary, and I was thinking. I watched the documentary when it came out because I followed what happened to you for such a long time. And when I first saw your Netflix documentary, I was quite disappointed, maybe. I felt like it was a weird framing of the story, but actually I found on a rewatch that it did a really good job at exposing the farce of everything that happened to you. Mm-hmm. I thought it was really smart the way that the filmmakers made that documentary, in that they kind of just let the guilty parties trip themselves up, but it didn't pillar them either. And there's a lot of really frightening things that I thought from that rewatch, you say that thing at the beginning about almost like the perception of you was people's worst fear, almost like you are a monster or you're just like them. But the thing I found most scary was how everyone involved thought they were right.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
that's kind of terrifying.
Well, and what's more terrifying is that that's just the way the world is. Everyone always thinks they're right, even when they're wrong. And a lot of times, the reasons why people think they're right when they're wrong aren't because they're like devious people. It's because they're living in these little echo chambers and they have these cognitive biases that are in play. So I think for me, the big sort of takeaway from this experience, especially when I sort of am haunted by the question of why did this happen? It all goes back to, it's not about good or bad people. It's not about black or white narratives. It's about real human beings being caught up in the stories that they're telling themselves, and being sort of unwilling to reevaluate that story because of what it means about them as a human being. And that's an ongoing issue. Even though the courts eventually found me completely innocent and acquitted me, that doesn't mean that the story about me has gone away, nor does it mean that the people who are responsible for telling that story have come to grips with their role. So
I mean, what happened to you is a experience far beyond other people that I've spoken to on this podcast, but a commonality with people I've spoken to who have been shamed is that they are looking for some sort of vindication in the person that shamed them admits that they're wrong. And I think that's so especially cruel because it keeps all of those feelings of being shamed going. Do you still have that, or have you accepted that there are people who just won't be able to see outside of their cognitive bias?
Um, so it's a little bit of both, right? I know that it's the longest possible shot in the world for someone to reevaluate, and by someone, I mean the people who are directly responsible for my wrongful conviction. I would say, the legal authorities in Italy, the various people who made a career out of vilifying me. Those It's a long shot that those people are going to actually be able to take a step back and realize, I thought I was doing the right thing, but actually I was committing a harm. And I should admit to that. Like, I understand that that's a long shot. I also don't think that it's impossible, though. And I feel like a lot of my life since coming home has been in conversation with the false version of me that was presented by these people. I'm constantly in conversation with that fake human being. In the end, the only thing that I have control over in this life is my own mind and my own heart. And I be at peace with myself. But that doesn't mean that it isn't a wonderful, valuable project to try to reach out to those who have harmed you. And not from a place of like trying to seek retribution or anything like that. In part for sort of a personal level of like satisfaction. There's no doubt a sort of personal satisfaction that one gets from being acknowledged person who harmed you. But at the same time, there's also this feeling of, so that it doesn't happen to the next person. Like, if I can prove that this horrible thing that happened to me happened, then maybe I can get people more aware of the way that these real human beings who thought they were doing the right thing tripped themselves up and inadvertently or explicitly tried to ruin an innocent person's life. Maybe we can all be a little bit more aware the next time. So there's this dual purpose, this sort of forward-looking purpose, but also a sort of personal peace-seeking opportunity that, I definitely feel like I'm still on that journey, but I don't have like my well-being wrapped up in or achieving that goal. It's more the journey that matters.
I always interject during these podcast interviews at some point and say that I have OCD.
Mm.
which has really shaped my worldview. I can't dispute the fact that, it's an illness that really changes the way that you see the world. I say this to say that I've had a lot of therapy. And one of the main learnings in therapy is that what other people think of you is none of your business. Which is kind of a little bit like what you're saying, in the sense that what I took from that was that you were saying that you only have control over your own actions. I wondered how you had acquired that knowledge, how you come to that realization, but also I don't know how relevant it is to you, because what happened to you took away your autonomy. It wasn't like you could go, okay, well, if I just continue down this path, then people will realize the injustice that has been committed on me.
So what you're saying is like, but you have every reason to be like, hey, this was totally interfering with your life. You were in jail. Like, I get it. Like, I know. And it's at the same time, almost like the fact that I was put into that completely stripped me away of not only like my identity as an innocent person, but my potential. Like my potential was completely limited and my opportunities in life were taken away from me. And I lived a very base existence where I had very little control over my own life. And that, like even just, when do I get to wake up and when do I get to eat food and when do I get to go outside and see the sunshine and when am I ever going to touch grass with my feet again? Well, maybe not for decades. Like the fact that I had so much taken away from me sort of crystallized for me the fact that what I did have, like what I retained, and what I retained is not control over my life, the external circumstance of my life, but a sense of presence and quasi control over my own feelings and actions and emotions. And I say quasi because in the end, you don't get to choose whether or not you wake up sad. You either wake up sad or you don't wake up sad. You can accept that and then continue throughout your day trying to make something meaningful out of your experience, or you don't. And that's a choice. So the sort of oddly being stripped of so much made me acutely aware of what I did have control over in a really base sense. And I didn't have the illusion of having more liberty and freedom than I actually do, which is sort of that weird, bittersweet reality that prison presented to me. Was like, the physicalness of the prison and its limitations was almost a metaphor for the prison of our own minds and experiences that every one of us has. And if anything, I just, you had it hammered home for me, the reality of what I actually have control over.
I love it doing this podcast when I speak to people who completely send the way that I think about this stuff into a tailspin, and it just happened when you were talking. And I was thinking that I'd almost sort of bought into the idea that what other people think of us matters, because I was saying, okay, well, I've learned this thing in my therapy about what other people think of you isn't any of your business, and the only thing you can control are your own actions. And I was saying to you that seemed very unfair when you were being persecuted for something that you didn't do. But at the same time, that's still all about perception. Like, if you are sat in your jail cell, you still must have known who you are. You must not have lost sight of who you are.
Exactly. Yep. That's exactly right. And if anything, another sort of the brutal truths of my really sudden traumatic situation was, yes, I found myself in a very bad situation. I was accused of a crime I didn't commit. I was in jail. I was facing losing the majority of my life to prison, but I was alive. And I was acutely aware that it was by chance that I was alive. And if I had been home the night that Meredith had been murdered, I could have been murdered too. And so, in a weird way, I was the lucky one. And so, being aware of that, and again, once again, like you think you know all of the opportunities that are in front of you and what could have happened, and you don't think, oh, I'm going to be murdered today. But like, I was suddenly very aware that I could have been murdered that day. And now that I was going through a completely horrible experience, but I was still alive. And so I did have something to be grateful for, even in this incredibly horrendous experience that I wouldn't wish upon anyone.
I mean, it's it's an impossible thing to be able to quantify, but do you, like, how much do you feel like you grew up when you were in prison? I mean, obviously, you know, I'm unaware of what you were like as a 20-year-old, but just from what I've read or snippets from the documentary or what I've heard you talk about in other interviews, like, you were like a quirky kid. That's what it seemed to me, working out what the world was all about. And talking to you just feel a little bit like I'm talking to like one of those like talking trees from Lord of the Rings.
Cool. I would love to be a talking tree from Lord of the Rings, one of the Ents. That's amazing.
It just feels like you know things. Do you feel like that's like prisons sped up that process?
Yeah. So one of my friends that I made in prison, the prison chaplain, which is kind of funny because I'm not a spiritual person at all, but he was my really good friend. He's just a really good guy. He said that I had aged 40 years in 40. But at the same time, I don't want to, like, to a certain extent, I did. A certain part of me aged that much. And yet another part of me was still a 20-year-old kid when I got out of prison and tried to navigate the free world and all of its complicating factors that I was very ill-equipped for. So in some ways, I was deeply mature, and in other ways I was not mature at all and not ready for the challenges that were ahead of me in the free world, especially when I was still on trial. That was another period of time that required a lot of like mental strength to get through, because it seemed like I had a life in front of me, and yet it was like my life was closer than ever, but I couldn't touch it. I wasn't allowed to put roots down. I still couldn't trust people. I lived in I lived in isolation without seeming like I was living in isolation, and that was another 4 years of my life, and that basically took up my entire 20s of being in various kinds of prisons. And yeah, so anyway.
One of the things that a lot of people with OCD who I'm in contact with, we talk about like grieving for the person that we could have been. In the we were on a path and then this horrendous illness came along. And a lot of people who I've spoken to this podcast say a very similar thing. Do you grieve for that person you were, or are you at a place of peace with who you are now?
That's a really good question, because I have complicated feelings about that. One thing that I think of is I do feel like despite how horrible the experience is, and I'm curious to know if you feel this way as well, given like the challenges of OCD, I do feel like the traumatic experience, having found ways of surviving it, and being sort of put through the fire and to once again like sort of crystallize those parts of yourself that you can rely on. I do feel grateful for that. So a part of me wonders, well, would I have been like, if this hadn't happened, would I be as thoughtful or have the perspective that I have today? Because like what I went through was so unexpected and opened my eyes to a lot of realities that I just did not have access to before this. So a part of me wonders, would I be as good a person if I hadn't gone through it? On the other hand, I'm deeply scarred in a way that I wouldn't have been otherwise as a result of this experience. And it has impacted the way that I view the world, and it has impacted my relationships and the opportunities that I have available to me. And I often feel like I'm having to forge a path ahead where, without any guidance, just understanding the unique circumstances of my conditions. And it's challenging. And so I don't know. I mean, I do mourn the loss of the sort of naive person that I could have been, who was still a good person, by the way. Like I was totally nice and chill and had, goals and dreams that were totally legitimate beforehand. And those have shifted now, given the external circumstances and the internal world that I have. But I do feel like all anyone can ever do is be their best self, whatever circumstances come your way. And you don't get to choose those circumstances, and you don't even get to choose how you feel about those circumstances. All you can choose is to, at any given moment, try to be your best self. And that means that anything that happens is an opportunity. And that sounds, like super cheery and guru-y, but it's true in this really like deep way. And it doesn't mean that it's fun. Like it's super not fun to be scarred, right? Like to have earned a perspective through pain and suffering. It definitely makes it so that it's harder to do things in the world sometimes. But there's still that like deep human value and purpose and meaning, regardless of whether, like, how those challenges present themselves to you.
I think with my experience, and also with the people on this podcast I've spoken to who've been shamed or have had something beyond their control happen in their life that has left them feeling shame, or even actually in some cases in episodes that haven't aired yet, people who have done things that they're ashamed of.
Mm-hmm.
The word empathy gets thrown about a lot, and I'm very much, without getting too woo-woo, like I'm very much of the belief that if anything is going to save the world, like it is empathy. But I feel like it can be quite lonely feeling like that when other people don't feel like that. Almost like it's an evolutionary flaw to exist within the world as it is. So I find, for example, that I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for people who've done very, very bad things, because I think those people are human. And I think that's really important, that we don't dehumanize people and lose track of the fact that people are more than a moment, or that people exist somewhere between good and bad. Like there's no definites. And I thought there was something that I really related to when you were talking on the Joe Rogan podcast about people you'd met in prison, some people who'd committed infanticide, which is as heinous a crime as most people could think of.
Yeah.
And yet you saw more than that label. And I guess what I'm trying to say in a very roundabout way is that is it tiring having that empathy that you've acquired from your experience? I find that on things like I find, for example, the news cycle very, very difficult, because I can see so many different perspectives. Like Twitter is a nightmare for me, because when someone's being called out, I'm going, yeah, but you don't know what's going on that end. And that's just not the way the world works. The world's too fast for that. It's too cruel for that. Mm-hmm. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I think the most difficult thing for me is when you do the hard work of empathizing with, and that hard work is not reciprocated, right? Like that really sucks, because in the end, like, you can build a bridge 99.9% of the way, but for it to take hold, you need the other side of that bridge to be built at least 0.1% of the way. And to like work that hard to make connections and to not and have those connections rejected is deeply, deeply tiring. And and discouraging. Even you think like, well, I have all this empathy, but what good is it if like it's being rejected? um, and I think that there's just a sort of extra layer of empathy that you have to put on top of it, which is remembering that not everyone is ready to feel empathy, and everyone has to arrive. Like you can't drag someone kicking and screaming into a place of empathy and compassion. You have to meet everyone where they are and do what you can, while at the same time being aware of how that's impacting you. And if it means that you need to take space away from people or away from Twitter or whatever to like, regain a sense of balance so that you can continue to have empathy and compassion for the world, then you got to do that. And that, that doesn't feel good, because when you do see people out there sort of treating other people like scapegoats or jumping to automatic conclusions about people or just seeing the worst in somebody, you want to jump out and say, hey, but there's a human being there. Like, there's a real human being there, just like you, just like me. And wouldn't you want, if that was you, for your humanity to be recognized? You can keep trying to do that game of like, putting up your little red flag everywhere. And it can drain you, and it can leave you feeling diminished and discouraged, and like what you're perceiving and what you're experiencing doesn't matter. So it's a balance. And I definitely have felt that way. I've definitely had moments of like having to step back and being sad that you have to step back because you're ready to make that connection. You're ready to cross that bridge and see that human being for who they are, and all of that. You want to give them that, and they're not ready. That's hard, but you have to also have empathy for their experience of just not being able to recognize that that is something valuable to them yet. So, yeah.
I think one of the things I'm thinking of when I say all this is that there was a tweet that you sent that you got a load of blowback for. And I'm trying
Which one?
Well, there was one that really stuck out, and it was for the ferocity of the responses that you got. And I think it was something about, was it something to do with Trump? It was something to do with 4 years.
Oh, yeah. So like, it was actually funny. I wasn't even meaning to be funny. Although in the end, I did like put it out there because I thought, oh, that's a kind of funny way to say this. But it was right before the American election. So everyone was like sitting on pins and needles, wondering what the next 4 years of our country were going to look like. And, I was sitting in my car talking to my husband, and I was thinking, God, we're all just so anxious and scared, and what's going to happen? And he was like, yeah, well, but it's 4 years, right? Like, let's keep perspective. It's 4 years. And let's remember that you did 4 years of something and survived. And I was like, you know what? That's funny. Like, no matter what happens, no matter who gets elected, it's still going to be okay. Like, we're going to survive it. And it's not going to be as bad as sitting in prison for 4 years. Like, and so I made that joke, like, oh, whatever happens, it's going to be better than my like 4-year study abroad program in Italy. And I got so much flack for that. And once again, because it was people sort of arguing that whenever I reference my own sort of traumatic experience, they think I'm comparing my traumatic experience to Meredith's traumatic experience, as if like I can't even talk about my own traumatic experience without somehow being offensive to Meredith's memory. And that is because I have been, unfortunately, linked in people's minds. They just can't separate what happened to me from what happened to Meredith, despite the fact that I had nothing to do with what happened to Meredith. And whatever I say is in no way speaking to the trauma that she suffered and that her family suffered. So I find myself having to remind others that I'm not like one side of a coin and the other side is Meredith. And if you flip that coin, it's going to like either like whatever happens to me is not at the expense of what happened to Meredith and vice versa. We just happen to be unfortunately linked because the injustice that I suffered came at the heels of the injustice that she and her family suffered.
I think what I'm saying, though, is that when you sent that tweet and I saw the blowback you were getting, the thing that made me frustrated, upset, angry, all of these different emotions was that I couldn't understand how we are so, as a culture, we pay so much lip service to trauma or mental health or trying to understand why people are how they are or what they do or trying to understand each other. And I was just going, even if your intent wasn't pure, it was a glib comment, and someone who had experienced what you had experienced is totally within their rights to still be processing things in a unique way. Does that make sense? Like, when you sent it, I was going, well, okay, maybe some people might see that as a little bit insensitive, but this woman did spend 4 years in prison being accused of doing the worst thing a person can do. Like, it just made sense to me that I don't understand why people couldn't take a breath and go, well, that's why she's done that.
Well, I think part of the issue is a lot of people aren't practiced in taking a breath before having an automatic reaction. And from what I've experienced is because I'm an idea in people's minds more than I am a person in people's minds, people feel like they automatically know what that idea is, what it means, and what it stands for. And therefore they see everything that the symbol, do through that lens. And they're having like a conversation, like with a version of me that doesn't exist, which is really interesting. I almost feel bad bad for them because they are having they're working themselves up and agitating themselves up with something that doesn't even exist. Like I'm not even they're not even in conversation with me. And so I try to keep that in mind when I receive a bunch of a wave of hate that hits me every time that happens. But I also know that I'm not answerable to that. Like I'm not answerable to a fake idea version of me in other people's minds. So I don't feel compelled to honestly be in conversation with it. Like people can react how they're going to react. I've had more than that taken away from me, and you can't force me to feel shame for things that I have no reason to feel shame over. That's sort of like the interesting takeaway from this experience is you don't have to feel shame just because someone is trying to make you feel shame. And so I don't know, it's, if anything, I feel, I wonder if anyone who does that is going to have that moment of recognition. And I've had people come up to me before, I've given talks and things before where people have come up to me in tears, just sobbing because they feel so terrible about themselves for having bought into that fake idea version of me and treating me online according to that vision. And then having that shocking realization of, oh my God, I would never want to treat another human being the way, with this new perspective, this new lens. And I've had to tell them look, it's okay. The thing that you've arrived at right now where you're oh my God, I did something wrong. That's all the healing that you could possibly give me is just telling me I see you feeling that I'm a human being again. So that takes away all of the dehumanizing that you did to me before. And in the meantime, I'm not like, again, I'm not in prison anymore. So I, like, in a big way, I have what I need to live a fulfilling life. Um, Even as I struggle to reclaim my identity in an ongoing way. But it's not like, it's the difference between what I have now and what I had when I was in prison and on trial is tremendous. And I am incredibly grateful. And I know that like, everyone's got a struggle. Everyone has a hurdle in their life. Everyone feels trapped a little bit by something. And if this is the thing that I'm trapped in, like, at least I know it very well. I know what this is, and I know how to combat it. And I know how to make sure that it's not this giant monster that feels like it's overwhelming me. I can, like, put it in perspective, and I can put it in front of me, at least most of the time.
Yeah. Well, this is what I was going to say, was that I think the thing that I found most upsetting that you have said was on the Joe Rogan interview, when you said that for some people, their idea of Amanda Knox is all you'll ever be. And I guess that I'm working on an episode for the podcast at the moment about cancel culture. I don't really like that term. I think it's been weaponized by people to mean something else. But I think a much better term is almost this idea of, like, cursed culture. This idea of the projection of an idea of who someone is, and that person then cannot be free of that. And I also think another thing with you as well is that you are obviously, this is the bit where anyone listening to this podcast might want to get out the sick bag, but, you know, you are obviously a very intelligent person. You're charming, you're funny.
No, that's what you mean.
Yeah. Okay. Like you, in an alternate timeline, maybe people would have known Amanda Knox for something other than what happened to you, if that makes sense. Maybe you would have written the next great American novel by the time you were 25. Maybe.
Probably not.
Okay, well, maybe not. But maybe you would have gone to Italy and formed a band. Maybe you would have gone to Italy or whatever.
Sure.
Like, and I guess with that, like, do you still feel? I mean, I know that interview was only a couple of months ago, but do you still feel like that, or do you really feel like that, or how do you wriggle out of that? Like, this idea, because you said something just then about shame and about how, and it's the thing that I hear time and time again on this podcast, when people say, actually, the thing with shame is people might want you to feel shame, or they might try and shame you, but it is a choice whether you accept it. However, there's still that thing of, for example, I feel this with my own experience, that I can walk down the street and feel like there is this veneer of tar that I cannot be free of. Mm-hmm. How have you tried to wriggle free of that?
Well, I think maybe I'm once again quite lucky, because what people want me to feel shame for is something that I didn't do. So I don't have I don't have, like, a little part of me that's like, you should feel shame. Like, and no part of me is like, you should feel shame. I know that I don't have any reason to feel shameful about what happened to me. It was a thing. I'm a victim of a criminal justice system problem. So I'm not worried about that so far. I do struggle, though, on an ongoing basis with the fact that my identity is wrapped up with a horrible thing that happened to an innocent young woman, and that it seems like nothing I will ever actually do will be as definitive of my identity as being unfairly associated with this horrible thing that happened. And as I navigate through the world, I'm constantly reminded that nothing I do, all of the opportunities that I have available to me are in conversation with the fact that I am a sociopath. Like I can't get a job without it being a thing. Like I have this baggage that I carry around that we have to sort of hold on to. I'm carrying around this heavy box that I can't quite get a grip on. And it's just somebody loaded it onto me one day and I just have to carry it with me. So whatever I end up doing, I am carrying it with me. And I'm, one of the biggest challenges that I'm facing right now is how do I wrap my mind around how that impacts the people I love, and particularly my future children. Because it's one thing for it to be me to carry that around and to be in conversation with. It's quite another thing for my innocent children to have to be in conversation with that. And that's a way that I do feel tarred and feathered, where it's like, I feel like my own children don't have a choice but to have to live in conversation with that story. And I wish that they didn't have to. And I still don't really know how to fully protect them from that, if not to just give them the tools to adapt to the situation as it is. But I wish that I didn't have to bring that burden onto my family.
I'm going to do an episode at some point about the blast radius of shame and about how when a person is shamed, it isn't, it can be the children of a person or it can be the spouse of a person. How did your family, your sisters or your mum and dad, like how did they cope with the whisper network when they went into a supermarket, or did they learn anything from it? Or
I feel like they're also still really processing it. I know that there have been it's actually been really interesting. It's one of the harder things that I have faced since coming home is talking with my family members about how it impacted them. And it did deeply impact them, especially my younger sisters. And I think to this day, they are still grappling with the fallout of all of the challenges that they faced, be it, the big obvious ones like the shame and the stigma that comes with being Amanda Knox's sister, Amanda Knox's family, Amanda Knox's supporters who are speaking out for her against the odds. But there's also the interpersonal ones, the fact that all of my family's energy and resources were taken away from everything else and put towards helping me at the expense of my younger sisters. And that includes emotional energy and attention. So, for 4 years, when my younger sisters were in very developmental ages, their lives and experiences and emotions were kind of secondary. And that is really hard. And each one of them sort of experienced that in a different way. And, I have to say that it's an ongoing process to be okay, or to to get through it, and to put that period in it doesn't feel like it's in the past yet, and yeah, I guess that's all I can really say about that. It does, the ripple effects of this, you're right, the blast radius of shame is immense, and it doesn't just impact ground zero, it impacts everyone around it inevitably. So it's hard.
I mean, it's hardly comparable, but I find with some of my stuff that my mother, for example, spent so much of her time and energy on me in my 20s that my brother didn't get the time that he should have been, and that's because my mum is a superhero, but she isn't. She is mortal, you know.
She's got limits, you know. Yeah.
And then how that plays out is that whilst I feel better about a lot of the things I struggle with, I often feel a lot of guilt when I am sat there with my brother and he's talking about some of the problems that he's had, because I think, oh, well, if I hadn't have had my stuff, then maybe my mum could have. Yes, it's going to be a good episode, that, when I get it finished. The other thing I wanted to ask was, there's so many reasons with hindsight why what happened to you happened. Unquestionably, there's sexism, religious fervor, I can almost argue, like a judgment about sex. Like, there's loads of reasons, but the thing that frustrates me most, and I wonder if we have learned any lessons from this, is that it's the idea of like almost like the COD psychology that surrounded you, in that she's kissing her boyfriend, or she is doing the splits, or whatever, and somehow people can. I don't think it's just about projecting their own bias on it. I think it's also that there is this culture that we know who a person is because we've been told by magazines or TV or social media that this is how we read people. And I think it's so wrong. Do you feel like that still exists?
Oh, yeah. And that definitely still exists to this day, unfortunately, because, and I think ultimately it kind of comes down to motivated reasoning. Like, do you want to see the guilt in someone? Well, you will find reasons to view them in a guilty way. Do you want to justify your feelings, your prejudice towards another human being? Well, you're going to find reasons to justify your prejudice. That is a sort of deep, not just like societal institutional problem, but a deep sort of human psychological problem that then becomes amplified in spaces like the media or the criminal justice system. And we still haven't really fully come to grips with how our ability to judge human beings is complicated and corrupted. I think in part because we want to view ourselves as rational. We want to think of ourselves as having a keen and acute grasp on justice, and therefore a keen and acute grasp of our judgments of other people. And we don't want to think, oh, well, actually, maybe I'm viewing this person in an irrational way. And because, like, one of the things, and one of the reasons why I brought up Monica Lewinsky's new documentary, 15 Minutes of Shame, is because she interviews someone who I have a ton of respect for, and you should absolutely interview for your podcast, John Ronson, who wrote So You've Been Publicly Shamed. And one of the things that he points out is that, you know, just the internet pile-on shaming that happened initially began and felt like it was a good thing. It felt like it was the sort of the world of underdogs finally having a stage and a means by which to hold people who are bigger and corporations like accountable in ways that, like, prior to that was impossible because the people individually didn't have any kind of power or resources. And that sense of like righteousness in judging and tearing down is actually one of the ways that it has been corrupted, because we still feel that we are righteous in tearing down and judging other human beings. We're not sitting there being self-aware that that sense of righteousness is potentially irrational or potentially cruel. And that's the danger of it, is we think we're doing the right thing. Or at least we feel that even if we're not sure if it's the right thing, we feel justified or that the person deserves something. And we aren't taking the time to really examine whether or not our feelings are justified and whether or not that human being deserves what's happening to them. We also have a very like myopic view of what is happening to that person. Like one person will send a message, but they don't know how many other people are sending a message. In my case, it was very clear, like, oh, the consequence of it is here's an innocent person that was put in jail. We're all very aware of what happened there. But since coming home, like I think people have this myopic understanding of how this has impacted my life. They don't see it from all the different angles. It's not this clear-cut prison or freedom. And so it's difficult for people when they are piling on or when they are judging to understand what all of those pieces together feel like to the person at the center of that shame storm.
I should say that John Ronson is kind of my hero.
Yeah, I know, right?
I know people who know him, and I know that you're friendly with him. I haven't reached out to speak to him because I'm a little bit scared that he'll go, why are you doing this podcast? I wrote a book about it, and that was kind of the final word. What are you trying to squeeze out of this?
No. He is not like that at all. I think that he's very generous with his time. And also I think he's kind of glad that other people are talking about shame, because he sort of became the shame guy, like the guru of shame. And he was like, I'm not the guru of shame. I just wrote a book, and I hope that starts conversation. So I think that he'd be happy. Is my experience with him would be that I would guess that he would be totally chill with you doing this.
well, he has actually, he's liked a couple of tweets and things. So I've sort of thought, maybe it's slightly on his radar. Thanks so much for giving me some of your time. Mm-hmm. Can you, do you want to tell people about your podcast? That's amazing.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Yes, I have a podcast that I write and produce with my husband, Christopher Robinson. It's called Labyrinths, Getting Lost with Amanda Knox. So all of those situations where you feel lost or overwhelmed and you don't know the way out, that is a metaphor that can refer to wrongful convictions or to illnesses or to shaming events. Like we all have a time in our lives when we felt really lost and we didn't know the way out. And so I talk to people about those experiences, plus more.
I might have to work on you to do an episode about OCD, but we'll talk about that down the line.
I'd love that. Yeah, it'd be great.
Well, there you go. Thanks to Amanda for taking the time to speak to me and for sharing her wisdom. If Amanda Knox, all the wrongs that were done to her and the spite and the prejudice that threatened to terminally derail her life, well, if Amanda can live a life free from the shame imposed on her, well, anyone can. And thanks also to my friend Grace Harrison for helping me out with a few bits in the recording of the episode. That's a giggle you can hear at the episode's start. And thanks to all of you guys for tuning in and your ongoing support of this podcast. We're almost at episode 10, where we'll be having a break before returning for season 2. If you enjoyed this episode, I welcome you to investigate some of the other episodes up to this date. And if you enjoyed this one, a rating, a review, and a subscription would mean the world to me. While I'm here, I might as well plug a few more bits I do. I run a podcast about music called, conveniently, the James McMahon Music Podcast. You can get that anywhere that hosts podcasts, and I run one about OCD too. Same deal there. It's called the OCD Chronicles, wherever you get your podcasts. And I run a Substack at Spook, that's 3 O's, where I write about all sorts of things. A subscription to that really helps support the journalism and the other creative pursuits I'm involved in. Shame is a Spook Media production. I've been James McMahon, and until next time, I'm wishing you a week of mental and spiritual freedom, as well as much hope, and a sprinkling of joy too.